It's great to welcome to the program today Elizabeth Kolbert, who's a writer for The New Yorker and also author of the book The Sixth Extinction, which I read a couple of months ago now, I would say. Really fascinating book, Elizabeth. And interestingly, this week we actually got a report from Biodiversity International, which is saying we are in the midst of a sixth mass extinction, which is going right along with the subject matter of the book. So for people who don't know what we're talking about, what were the first five extinctions? Why are we already on number six? How did you first sort of come to know of this topic and start writing about it and researching the book?
Well, those are there's a lot of questions there.
Yeah.
The first question, what were the previous five? That goes back a long way. So we're talking about basically the whole history of multicellular life, which is, very roughly speaking, half a billion years. And during that time, the fossil record just shows us that there have been five major mass extinctions, the most famous of which is the fifth, the end Cretaceous extinction, which is the event that did end the dinosaurs. And there's a pretty broad scientific consensus that that was caused by an asteroid impact. So the idea that we're in the sixth, and so these events are events that during which the diversity of life on planet Earth plunged very suddenly, once again in geological terms. And to say that we're in the sixth, so in each of those events, roughly three-quarters of the species on Earth were lost. Um, and if we are currently in another one, that's obviously a very, very big deal. And the reason that many scientists think we are in the midst of another one or on the verge of another one is simply that extinction rates are extremely high, really astronomically high, compared to what's called the background rate, which is just the rate at which you'd expect species to go extinct in sort of the ordinary course of geological time. And the way I got on this subject is I was interested in what was being called the amphibian crisis. So a lot of amphibians are frogs and toads and salamanders, a lot of amphibian populations around the world were crashing and people were trying to figure out why. And in the process of reporting that story, investigating that story, I came across this idea that we're now in the midst of another mass extinction, and that just struck me as extraordinary. That I didn't know about this, and it seemed to me that everyone ought to know about it.
And in the course of researching the book, I mean, you mentioned the amphibian crisis, and that took you to South America for part of your research. We also interviewed Ken Caldera, who you joined near Australia, but at the Great Barrier Reef. How long was the entire process of doing all the research for this book, including all these different trips that you participated in?
Well, the whole process took more than 4 years, 4.5 years, I'd say, from sort of conception to handing in a manuscript. So it's a pretty long process.
And it seems that in a number of these different circumstances, you ended up sort of camping out in relatively precarious situations. Were you much of an outdoors person before doing this project? I mean, how foreign were some of those environments you found yourself in?
Well, I mean, I certainly have been on a lot of hiking trips and camping trips, but when you go to some of these places that are very remote, you really need to know what you're doing. And I was really fortunate in to be able to go with people who really knew what they were doing, because I would not have, simply found my way in a lot of them. But they were amazing places to get to, the Amazonian rainforest and the cloud forest of Peru and the Great Barrier Reef, and just some of the most spectacular places on Earth.
Was there a particularly shocking moment in terms of, as people read through the book, they will learn about the frogs in South America, the problems with coral reefs, dead bats, right? I mean, there's sort of different aspects to this issue that you touch on to paint the picture. Was there something you personally experienced that was sort of like the most shocking moment in terms of what you were witnessing in person during the process of researching this book?
Well, one of the sort of interesting paradoxes of researching the book is that I went to these amazing places, um, many of them very remote. But the point of being there was looking for how human impacts, some of which were very obvious, and some of which were, pretty subtle and had to be teased out through, chemical analysis. But I think that what did really, one of the most amazing places I went during the reporting of the book was the Great Barrier Reef. And the predictions for the future of the Great Barrier Reef are very dire. And actually, since I was there, so I guess you could say this was not in the course of reporting the book, but very shortly thereafter, there have been several major bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef. So that's when the water temperatures get too high and a lot of the coral turns white. And if water temperatures stay high, the corals die. And if you look, you can go online and find video of people just taking these small planes like over the Great Barrier Reef and shooting down, and you see vast expanses of the reef have turned white. And there have been several major bleaching events since I was on the Great Barrier Reef, and the future of the Great Barrier Reef, which I unfortunately sort of outlined in the book, just based on modeling and predictions, is starting to really come true. And that's as I say, just in a few years. That's a really, really sobering and pretty horrifying thought, because the Great Barrier Reef, which when I saw it was already, had been severely, damaged, was still a spectacular place, full of life.
Certainly, human impact is one of the biggest themes that goes throughout discussions of the sixth extinction. Can you talk to our audience a little bit about, I think most people sort of have an understanding of fossil fuel use and the way that impacts our planet. Trash in the oceans is a big deal. Deforestation, and that's also connected to your book, The Sixth Extinction. What are some of the other areas here that we should be thinking about in terms of how humans on the planet are impacting what you write about and what we're talking about when we talk about the sixth extinction?
Well, there are multiple drivers of extinction right now. You mentioned some of the big ones. The climate is changing, so many species are on the move, looking for ways to sort of follow the climate that they are used to, which means in many cases moving towards the poles or moving up elevational gradients. Another big issue that's potentially a very large driver of extinction, and I think one of the big ones that really hangs over this whole issue, though it does not get the kind of press that climate change does, is what's known as ocean acidification. And that's sort of the often referred to, or sometimes referred to as global warming's equally evil twin. And what happens when we burn fossil fuels, when we dump a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, is that very quickly a lot of that CO2 gets absorbed in the surface waters of the ocean. It dissolves in the ocean. And when CO2 dissolves in water, it forms an acid, carbonic acid. It's you drink it, if you have a Coke or if you had some club soda today, you drank carbonic acid, so it's a weak acid. But if you add enough of it to the oceans, you change their chemistry, and that's what we're doing. And when scientists look back at the fossil record, and they look at moments where the oceans became more acidified, those are often really, really bad moments for life in general. So that's a very big issue hanging over planet Earth right now.
And that one also seems to be, from our conversation with Ken Caldera about this, some of the so-called, I don't want to use the word solutions, but actions that could be taken to mitigate other aspects of climate change would not really help ocean acidification. In other words, like solar engineering in order to deflect some sunlight to deal with the warming component would not even touch the CO2 in the oceans aspect. He talked about, sort of like antacids in large bodies of water, but that practically speaking, that doesn't really seem to be a great idea. That seems to be a particularly tough one.
Yes, and I think that that is why, that one of the scary things about, or one of the many scary things about, this world that we're creating, is that there is the potential to do things that would help, us, ourselves, our species, but that would be really, really devastating for other species, many, many other species. And I think there's really a question which is very difficult to answer in the abstract about whether you can, trash marine life, ocean life, and whether humanity can really do that without severe penalty and disruption to human life. So I think people need to be much more aware of these issues. I think we have any of the answers, but we're certainly not. We're certainly treading on into very dangerous territory.
The book is The Sixth Extinction. We've been speaking with the book's author, Elizabeth Kolbert. We'll pause our conversation there and continue tomorrow. We're continuing our conversation with Elizabeth Kolbert, who's a writer for The New Yorker, also author of the book, The Sixth Extinction. In the first part of the interview, we talked a lot about the sort of facts on the ground and the research you participated in writing the book. I'd like to talk a little bit with you about sort of the political situation around climate change and extinction. Is part of the problem in your mind that, as you mentioned, we have a sixth extinction apparently happening here very quickly in geological time, which of course, for the scope of a human life, is still a very, very long time. Is that part of why it can be difficult to really build consensus and take action on the broader issue of climate change? Because when you have elections every 2 or 4 years, limited resources, and people wanting to get reelected, the timeline that a lot of these things are happening on doesn't really lend itself to the type of conversations we should be having?
Yes, I think that's definitely part of it, but it's not entirely adequate because there are obviously a lot of issues that we do deal with that are certainly multi-decade and even multi-generational in scope. And somehow we have managed to deal with them. So climate change seems to present us with almost a uniquely dangerous situation. And many people have tried to come at this for different reasons. Why is it that something that is really, potentially, and I don't think I'm exaggerating here, an existential threat to humanity, but we seem unable to take really even the first baby steps towards trying to solve it. In fact, you have a lot of people out there, and many of them now occupy the highest offices in American government, who simply deny that there's a problem. Now, we are so far beyond the point where you could deny that there's a problem. And I believe that people increasingly see this just around them. They feel it around them. I'm now sitting, in New England. It's in the high 80s. We should have had a frost by now. We're nowhere near that. So I think people see, obviously, the climate is changing. It's no longer very subtle, I'm afraid.
Have you come across any ideas as to how we might more effectively communicate with so-called climate skeptics or deniers of science? We know from the research done by folks like Daniel Kahneman, for example, that just sort of beating people over the head with facts does not really seem to be too effective in bringing people over and sort of predisposing them to want to take action. Is there like a patriotic appeal that could be made, maybe a national security appeal that you've thought of? I mean, what might be a better approach to try to build consensus?
Well, I think that as you say, the thrust of a lot of social science research over the last 20, 30 years has been, you can give people as much information, practical, objective information as you want, and it doesn't really change their mind once their identity is sort of tied up with believing one thing or another. And I think that many people have concluded, therefore, and so we're in this kind of interesting standoff, that people like me, the media, even politicians on the left, even are not going to, or on the left, center left, whatever, are not going to be the ones who are going to be able to reach people whose political identities or cultural identities are now tied up with denying that climate change exists. That the messengers are going to have to change. Religious figures, generals, all of those right-wing talk show hosts, all of those are potentially people who could change this conversation, but they have to want to change the conversation.
Well, what would make them want to, I guess, is the question, right?
That is exactly what we're waiting for. That is what we're waiting for. And if I had that answer, I'd be out there trying to make it happen. How's that?
There is this kind of like inherent optimism that exists in some people who say we don't need to worry about this. And I'm not talking about those who say God would never have set up a planet that we could damage, right? I'm not talking about that view. I'm talking very specifically about the view, which is I'm not worried about this because humans are smart and resourceful and will
Right,
always stay slightly ahead of it actually
right,
becoming a crisis. How do you
right.
communicate with someone like that and explain to them that the crisis is now, that we're seeing more, heat-related deaths among the very young and elderly than we've seen for a long time? Weather event, whatever argument you can make, how can you
Yeah.
explain that this is already sort of outpacing human ingenuity?
Well, I think that what people really need to appreciate with climate change and why climate scientists have really been trying desperately to issue these warnings is that there's a tremendous amount of inertia in the climate system. And it's not the case that you can say, and the inertia springs from a few different directions, as it were. First of all, there's still warming in the pipeline. So even if we just really stopped emitting CO2, basically tomorrow, which evidently we're not going to do, there's still a lot of warming left in the system until the climate reaches a new equilibrium. And I'm not going to go into the kind of geophysics of that, but it's pretty basic science. And so what you're seeing, what you see out your window, the idea that, okay, when it gets really bad, we'll fix it, that is simply, in this case, unfortunately not possible because you've already set things in motion that you can't get back. This is why scientists are so worried, for example, is the West Antarctic ice sheet starting to disintegrate? Because once you set that in motion, there's a lot of inertia in that system, and you're not going to get that back. So that's one reason why we really need to be proactive as opposed to reactive. Another reason is obviously just that energy systems take a long time to convert. It's very, very difficult to our whole economy, the entire world economy, basically for all intents and purposes right now runs on fossil fuels. If you want to change that, which evidently we have to, you've got to get going and you've got to get started, and you can't expect it to happen tomorrow. So there's a lot of inertia in that system as well. And when you sort of add together all these forms of inertia, you realize that we really needed to start this process a long, long time ago.
Is there anything you're seeing that makes you at all optimistic? And it could be either at the, micro level, at a more macro level. It could be, changes we're seeing in China or India that are slowly moving away from fossil fuels as the sole sort of provider of energy, even though it's happening relatively slowly. Something that, a private company like Tesla is doing. We've had 7 or 8 countries in Europe that have said over the next 10 or 20 years they want to get all fossil fuel using vehicles off the roads. I mean, it all sort of feels like they're not really the strongest commitments. They could be changed if it ends up not being that convenient. And even still, it might end up being sort of too little too late. I mean, is there something to be optimistic about?
Well, I think that those are the wrong, that those are sort of the wrong categories that we keep looking for some. I think one of the other problems that we have in dealing with climate change is that we keep looking for some answer. There's going to be one answer that's going to, sort of silver bullet, and it's just not that kind of a problem. You're going to need a million different answers. But I do think the one hopeful development, I suppose you could say, is the really, really radical decline in the price of solar power, so that there are now times of day in certain parts of the country, certain parts of the world, where basically you're giving away power. And once that happens, there's a lot of things that you can do with that power that might be really useful, like charge your electric car and things like that. So I think that is a very positive development. And one thing that it shows, if you talk to experts, is that that didn't just happen. That happened because there were a lot of entities, including the Chinese government and the German government, which put a lot of money into solar power, and what's known as feed-in tariffs, where basically utilities had to buy solar power. All these things, that I won't get into the sort of bogged down in the bureaucratic details, but a lot of effort on the part of a lot of governments, and also entrepreneurs went into this. And we need that on many, many different fronts. So that unfortunately brings us back to the current administration, which is actually, their budget just slashed R&D on a lot of these programs, which is obviously exactly the wrong way to go.
Yeah, I mean, along those lines, at face value, at the 30,000 foot level, it seems, well, one thing that should happen is government should stop subsidizing oil and the production of gasoline and instead put those subsidies towards renewable energy. Is it that simple? Would that make a big difference?
That would make a huge difference. I think people don't really appreciate, how many tax. Once again, we don't see them unless you're in the, oil industry, the coal industry. You don't know where the tax breaks are, but they're huge, and people have compiled them, and those amount to government subsidies. And when you compile them, they're in the, I can't remember if they're in the, hundreds of billions of dollars. If they're, I don't remember what the figures are, but they're very, very high. And if we took all that, that pot of money, which is basically a pot of missing revenues, and we put it toward, took it away from things that we don't want and put it towards things that we do want. I don't want to say it would solve the problem, but it would be a huge step in the right direction. Let's put it that way.
We've been speaking with Elizabeth Kolbert. She writes for The New Yorker, also author of the book, The Sixth Extinction, which I recommend highly to the audience. Elizabeth, thank you so much for talking to us about this.
Oh, thanks for having me.